Hello, and a very warm welcome to Bittersweet. We're so glad you've chosen to join us. Take a moment and think about your kitchen. Think about the simple things you see every day. A bag of sugar for your morning coffee, the tea bags in the cupboard, the chocolate bar you save for a treat. They feel mundane, don't they? Harmless, even. We interact with these items daily, rarely giving them a second thought. But what if I told you these aren't just simple things, that they are, in fact, artifacts of geopolitics? That behind each grain of sugar lies a colossal history of corporate greed, fallen empires, and unimaginable wealth. And, most importantly, a history where millions of human beings were brutalized, enslaved, and killed. We don't think about it, but we should. Today, our story begins with one of those simple things, sugar. In this series, we will peel back the sweet veneer to reveal the brutal, bloody, and world-changing story hidden within each crystal. We'll expose how the insatiable human desire for sweetness fueled a ruthless machine of conquest and exploitation that lasted for centuries. We will travel from the courts of European kings to the sweltering, deadly plantations of the New World. We will witness the birth of the transatlantic slave trade and see how nations were built and how entire continents were condemned to poverty, all in the pursuit of this white gold. This is the story of how sugar shaped our modern world in ways you can't possibly imagine. So pour yourself a drink, perhaps one without sugar for now, and settle in. The story we're about to tell is anything but sweet. Chapter 1. From Ancient Medicine to Crusaders' Gold. Our story begins not in a grand empire, but in the lush, tropical jungles of Southeast Asia. Here, for countless centuries, sugarcane grew wild. For a long time, people simply chewed the raw stalks for a burst of sweetness. But then, in ancient India, a revolutionary discovery was made. The sweet juice could be boiled down and crystallized. By the 1st century AD, these strange, sweet crystals began to slowly spread along the world's ancient trade routes. Eventually, this new substance reached Europe. Ancient Roman and Greek writers mentioned it, but not as a food. To them, it was a rare and exotic medicine, prescribed for ailments and reserved for the wealthy elite. For centuries, that's what sugar remained in the European mind, a curious pharmaceutical. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe largely forgot about this sweet sand from the East. It would take a holy war to bring it back. In 1095, Pope Urban II declared the First Crusade, launching an era of conflict and collision between Europe and the Middle East. As Crusader knights marched into the Holy Land, they rediscovered sugar among the many treasures of the Arab world. The Arabs had long cultivated sugarcane across the southern and eastern Mediterranean, valuing it highly. The Crusaders, whom one chronicler called the sweet-toothed army, quickly developed a taste for what they called sweet salt. They saw its value not just as a spice, but as a commodity. According to one chronicler of the Crusades, sugar was a most precious product, very necessary for the use and health of mankind. With this realization, the first seeds of a global industry were planted. European merchants, always with an eye for profit, were about to turn this forgotten medicine into a mania that would consume the continent and eventually the world. Chapter 2. The First Plantations and the First Chains. The first to truly capitalize on Europe's budding sugar craze were the Venetians. These master merchants established the first commercial sugar production centers near Tyre in modern-day Lebanon, and from there began shipping it across the Christian world. But from its very inception, the industry had a dark side.
The work was hell on earth. Sugarcane stalks were thick, up to 10 centimeters in diameter, and breaking them down to extract the juice was a monumental task. It was practically impossible to do by hand, so specialized mills were invented to crush the cane. Then the extracted juice had to be boiled, a process that could take an entire day, tended to constantly over scorching fires. The raw cane itself was heavy and bulky, making logistics a nightmare. Unsurprisingly, there was no queue of willing workers for this grueling labor. So, as the demand for sugar grew, the entire operation was moved from Tyre to the island of Cyprus. And it was here, almost immediately, that the industry turned to a sinister solution to its labor problem: slavery. But these first slaves weren't from Africa. They were fellow Europeans who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The majority were captured from Greece, Bulgaria, and the Black Sea coast. By the 16th century, Cyprus had become the primary sugar supplier for all of Europe, a title it earned through the sweat and suffering of enslaved people. To understand its value, consider this. In 1532, a kilogram of Cypriot sugar sold on the Venetian markets for the equivalent of $172 in today's money. Today, that same kilogram costs about 44 cents. In the 16th century, sugar was nearly 400 times more expensive than it is now. It wasn't just a spice, it was true white gold. The potential for profit was astronomical, but it created a new problem: where to find more land to grow it.
Chapter 3: Columbus and a Sweet, Cursed Cargo. Sugar is a demanding crop. It needs a specific climate, warm weather, and it absolutely cannot tolerate frost. As Europeans began to look beyond their own shores during the Great Age of Discovery, they knew exactly what they would do with any new warm lands they found. They would plant sugar. The first European colonies outside of Europe were established in the Canary Islands. When the Spanish arrived in the early 15th century, the islands were inhabited by an indigenous people known as the Guanche. The Guanche had two choices: be killed or become slaves. The Spanish deemed the land perfect for sugarcane, and soon the Canaries were covered in plantations worked by the enslaved local population. The Guanche resisted, fighting back with spears and stones, but they were ultimately crushed and wiped from the face of the earth. Not to be outdone, Portugal began building its own colonial empire. They claimed the island of Madeira, just north of the Canaries. Unlike the Canaries, Madeira was uninhabited. There was no one to resist. It was a blank slate, perfect for a sugar-fueled experiment. Madeira quickly surpassed Cyprus as the world's leading sugar exporter, and along with the sugarcane, they imported slaves. First, they brought the enslaved Guanche from the Canaries, then Berbers from North Africa, and finally, it was on Madeira that the blueprint for the next 400 years was created. For the first time, the systematic, large-scale use of enslaved Africans on sugar plantations began. This model, conquering new lands and working them with enslaved people, was fresh in the minds of explorers like Christopher Columbus. His voyage in 1492 was driven by a clear business interest: find a shorter route to the spices of India. But even on his very first expedition, Columbus made a stop at the Canary Islands. He wasn't just resupplying, he was picking up a special cargo: sugarcane stalks. He wanted to see if they would grow in the new lands he hoped to find. He did not fail. In 1493, the first sugarcane was planted in the Americas. The Caribbean islands proved inhospitable to European grains, but bananas and sugar thrived. The climate, so similar to its native Indian jungles, was perfect. The stage was set for sugar to conquer the New World.
Chapter 4. The Black Legend and the Triangular Trade. With sugar firmly planted in the New World, the Spanish quickly expanded across the Caribbean. The era of the conquista, the conquest of new lands, had begun. The Aztec and Inca empires fell, and Spain earned the reputation of being the most brutal of all European colonizers. And while the cruelty of the conquistadores was undeniable, part of this reputation was also a tool of competitive propaganda. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Spain was the global superpower, a true empire on which the sun never set. This bred intense envy among its rivals, particularly the English and the Dutch. Stories of Spanish atrocities, the Inquisition, the slaughter of Protestants in Holland, and the genocide of indigenous Americans became the moral justification for fighting against this evil empire. This propaganda campaign became known as the Spanish Black Legend, painting the Spanish as uniquely cruel and bloodthirsty Catholic fanatics. While the brutality was real, it was hardly unique. Other colonizers simply had better public relations. Interestingly, Spain was one of the first colonial powers to grapple with the morality of slavery. Queen Isabella herself declared that the indigenous peoples should not be enslaved. This led to a hypocritical system called the encomienda, or trusteeship. In theory, a Spanish landlord was responsible for converting his indigenous workers to Christianity and introducing them to European culture. In practice, it was just slavery by another name. Eventually, the Spanish crown went further, passing laws that completely banned the enslavement of indigenous peoples. This created a massive labor crisis for the plantation owners. Who would now work the fields? The answer came from their Portuguese neighbors, who had already perfected a system: the importation of enslaved people from Africa. Under Spanish law, Africans were not granted the same protections as the native peoples. They could still be used as slave labor. And so, the floodgates opened. It's a lesser-known fact that while Spain relied less on slave labor than other empires, it was still responsible for bringing 22% of all enslaved Africans to the Americas. The era of the triangular trade had dawned, a monstrously profitable system that would make slavery the engine of the global economy.
Chapter 5. The Middle Passage, a journey through hell. The triangular trade was a cycle of breathtaking cruelty and profit. First, European ships sailed to the coast of West Africa, loaded with goods like textiles, gunpowder, and guns. There, they traded these items with local African rulers for human beings. The second leg of the journey was the infamous Middle Passage, the transportation of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to the colonies of the New World. On the third leg, the ships, now empty of people but full of cash, would buy colonial goods, chiefly sugar or rum made from it, and transport them back to Europe for sale. The profits were staggering. In the mid-17th century, an African slave could be purchased for £3 and sold in the colonies for around £20, a nearly 700% return. A century later, the prices had risen, but the profit margin remained immense. An enslaved person purchased for £20 would be sold for £75. For the price of a used car today, a ship captain could purchase a human life and sell them into bondage, making enough money after just a few voyages to set himself up for life. These are the origins of the old money of Britain, France, and Spain. Countless aristocratic families and the first great capitalists built their fortunes on the buying and selling of human beings. For those trapped in the trade, the journey itself was a descent into hell.
The Middle Passage could last anywhere from 6 to 20 weeks. People were packed into the ship's hold with terrifying efficiency. There were even manuals for slave traders illustrating the most economical ways to arrange human bodies to maximize capacity. The guiding principle was chilling. A slave should not occupy more space in the hold than they would in their coffin. The hold was dark, hot, and suffocating. A toilet was a luxury that did not exist. People were forced to relieve themselves where they lay. The stench was unbearable, and diseases like dysentery ran rampant. If you became seriously ill, you were simply thrown overboard like worthless cargo. In 1781, this practice became infamous in the case of the slave ship Zong. Its captain ordered over 130 living but sick Africans to be thrown into the sea, hoping to claim their value on his insurance policy. It was a journey of unimaginable horror, designed to break the body and the soul before a person even set foot on a sugar plantation.
Chapter 6. The African Coast, a Continent's Curse. The statistics of this trade are difficult to comprehend. By the end of the 19th century, historians estimate that nearly 12 million Africans were forced onto ships bound for the Americas. Of those, 1.5 million, 1 in every 8, died during the horrifying Middle Passage. But the devastation wasn't confined to the ships. Another 4 million people died on African soil during forced marches to the coast, in wars instigated to capture them, or during escape attempts. Tragically, African nations and rulers were not merely passive victims. Many became active participants in the trade, a decision that would prove catastrophic for the continent's future. Coastal states, armed with European guns, launched regular raids on their inland neighbors, capturing people to sell to the traders. This created a vicious cycle. The slave trade became Africa's own version of the resource curse. When a state discovers a single, highly profitable resource, it often abandons all other forms of economic development. For African kingdoms like Congo, human beings became that resource. Why develop agriculture, crafts, or institutions when you could simply maintain a powerful army, capture your neighbors, and sell them for European weapons to do it all over again? The Kingdom of Congo became so efficient at this that it supplied nearly 40% of all the slaves who reached the New World. This business model, kidnap your neighbor's son and sell him to strangely dressed white men, was brutally simple and tragically effective. The long-term consequences were devastating. The slave trade completely destroyed the potential for normal economic and industrial development in Africa. Generations of the strongest, most able-bodied men and women were stolen from their homes. The constant raids and wars bred deep-seated ethnic hatreds that persist to this day, fueling conflicts between modern sovereign nations. Traditional economies were shattered. The continent was left fractured, depopulated, and economically stagnant. It was this broken, traumatized Africa that Europeans would then colonize in the 19th century, justifying their actions by pointing to the very lack of development that they themselves had caused. Chapter 7. Brazil's Sugar Boom. While Spain was conquering Central America, Portugal was setting its sights on Brazil. Having already honed their sugar production techniques on Madeira, the Portuguese quickly transformed the coast of northeastern Brazil into the world's new sugar mecca. Here, however, they encountered local tribes like the Tupi and Guarani. The Portuguese, seeing people with no complex political structures or familiar religion, initially felt a kind of pity, but that sentiment quickly curdled into contempt. They viewed the indigenous people as savages, operating without faith, king, or law. This dehumanization paved the way for their enslavement. Answering to the Portuguese crown were the bandeirantes, ruthless slave-hunting adventurers, analogous to the Spanish conquistadors. Although the King of Portugal had officially forbidden the enslavement of indigenous people, no one in Brazil paid any attention to the decree. Plantation owners were desperate for labor, and the bandeirantes brutally filled the demand, hunting people in the interior and forcing them onto the sugar plantations. Entire tribes began to disappear. At the same time, the mass importation of African slaves began in earnest. In the eyes of the colonizers, African slaves had one significant advantage over the indigenous people. They were strangers in a strange land. An indigenous person could always escape into the jungle, their home. But an African, torn from their continent, had nowhere to run. They were isolated, their names replaced with Christian ones at baptism, their cultures erased. This dynamic created a complex racial hierarchy. A person's fate was tied to their skin color. Interracial relations were common, but a lighter skin tone offered a better chance at freedom, either granted for good behavior or upon the death of an owner. This history is why, to this day, Brazil has such a large population of people of African descent. Until the 19th century, enslaved Africans made up 70% of all people arriving in the country. Almost 5 million enslaved people were brought to Brazil, fully half of the total number brought to the entire New World. It's a paradox that the United States is seen as the quintessential slave nation, when the scale of slavery in Brazil was exponentially larger. For over a century, sugar was king, and Brazil was its throne, built on a foundation of human suffering.
Chapter 8. The Pearl of the Antilles. Brazil's reign as the world's sugar capital was not to last forever. Its dominance was challenged by the Dutch, who, in their relentless pursuit of profit, briefly occupied parts of northeastern Brazil, disrupting the sugar industry and causing prices to spike. This created a vacuum in the market. As the old saying goes, if you can't meet the demand, someone else will. And the nation that stepped in most effectively was France. France had been a latecomer to the colonial game, but what it lacked in timing, it made up for in ambition. Its prize jewel was a colony called Saint-Domingue, the western third of the island of Hispaniola, known today as Haiti. Initially, this territory was a backwater, a haven for pirates operating from the infamous island of Tortuga. But after France officially acquired the territory, it saw immense potential. Under the opulent reign of the Sun King, Louis XIV, no expense was spared in developing France's overseas possessions. Saint-Domingue was transformed into the most profitable colony in the world, earning the title the Pearl of the Antilles. The scale of its production was mind-boggling. On 8,000 plantations, this small colony produced more than half of all the sugar and coffee consumed in Europe and the Americas. It accounted for a staggering 40% of France's entire foreign trade. Saint-Domingue was not just a colony, it was the engine of the French economy. This incredible wealth was generated by an equally incredible amount of cruelty. The demand for labor was insatiable, with up to 30,000 new slaves imported every single year. This created a terrifying racial imbalance. On the eve of the French Revolution, the population of Saint-Domingue consisted of 40,000 white colonists, 28,000 free people of color, often of mixed race, and 450,000 enslaved Africans. The enslaved outnumbered the free by a colossal, overwhelming margin. A wealthy Creole planter on the island prophetically stated, "There was no colony in the world so rich and so intelligently managed, and at the same time so ripe for catastrophe." He was right. The catastrophe was just around the corner.
Chapter 9.
Revolution. The slaves strike back. In 1789, news from France arrived in Saint-Domingue that would shatter its fragile society. The publication of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was a bomb tossed into a powder keg. The document proclaimed that all men were born and remain free and equal in rights. How could such an idea possibly coexist with a colonial society built entirely on the principle of slavery? The island immediately fractured. The wealthy white planters, resentful of French trade restrictions, began calling for independence. The poorer whites, known as the Petit Blanc, wanted power but refused to grant any rights to the colored population. The free people of color, many of whom were wealthy and educated landowners themselves, demanded the full equality that the Declaration seemed to promise them. And the slaves? The slaves watched, and they waited. They saw the planters' talk of independence as a death sentence for any hope of freedom. In a desperate move to maintain control, the French government granted full citizenship to all free people of color. The white planters furiously resisted. It was the final straw. In August 1791, as revolution raged in France, a far more visceral one erupted on the island. The slaves rose up. 450,000 people, fueled by generations of rage, unleashed a firestorm of vengeance. They burned plantations to the ground and killed their former masters. Over 1,000 white colonists were killed in the first few days. The war became a chaotic free-for-all. Whites against whites, blacks against mulattoes. Britain and Spain, seeing an opportunity, invaded the island. Out of this chaos rose one of history's most remarkable figures, Toussaint Louverture, a former slave who became a brilliant general. He organized the rebel slaves into a disciplined army. First, they crushed their former masters. Then they defeated the professional armies of Britain and Spain. Louverture became the de facto ruler of an autonomous Haiti, famously writing to Napoleon Bonaparte and signing his letter, "From the first of the blacks to the first of the whites." Napoleon, who saw himself as the master of the world, was enraged. He sent an army to crush the enlightened Africans and restore slavery. Louverture was captured and died in a French prison, but his revolution was irreversible. The remaining rebels fought on, drove out the French for good, and in 1804 declared the independent Republic of Haiti, the world's first black republic, born from the world's only successful slave revolt.
Chapter 10. America's Sweet Tooth and the Taste of Freedom. The Haitian Revolution sent shockwaves across the globe. For slave owners from Virginia to Brazil, it was the ultimate nightmare made real. But its impact was especially profound on the young United States. Even before America had sugar plantations of its own, sugar was a cornerstone of its economy. Within the triangular trade, the North American colonies had a special role, turning Caribbean sugar and molasses into rum. Rum wasn't just a pirate's drink, it was a vital element of life in the New World. Rum produced in Rhode Island was so valuable that it was used as a form of currency in Europe. It was also a key instrument in the slave trade itself. The price of one enslaved person was often quoted in gallons of rum. This lucrative business was one of the first major industries of the future United States. Naturally, the British Crown wanted to control and tax this profitable trade. They first passed the Molasses Act, which imposed prohibitively high taxes on molasses imported from non-British colonies, like those of the French. When American merchants largely ignored this law through smuggling, the British cracked down with the Sugar Act of 1764. This new law lowered the tax, but dramatically increased enforcement. These laws struck at the heart of the American colonial economy. To make rum, distilleries needed a cheap, steady supply of molasses, much of which came from the French Caribbean. The British laws choked this supply chain. Suddenly, paying taxes to a distant government that offered no political representation felt deeply unjust. Many historians now argue that the Sugar Act, born from the geopolitics of the sugar trade, was one of the primary catalysts for the American War for Independence. The famous cry of "no taxation without representation" was not just an abstract principle. For many, it was a direct response to the Crown's interference in the immensely profitable industries of sugar and rum. The road to freedom, it turns out, was paved with sugar.
Chapter 11. The Louisiana Grind. The bloody slave revolt in Haiti had another, more direct consequence for the United States. Napoleon, having lost his prize colony and the immense sugar profits it generated, soured on his ambitions for a grand French empire in the Americas. Terrified of another slave uprising spreading to France's other major North American territory, he decided to cut his losses. In 1803, he sold the vast Louisiana territory to the United States. With that sale, America didn't just acquire land, it acquired a well-established sugar industry. Fleeing the revolution in Haiti, many French colonizers had relocated to Louisiana, bringing their expertise in sugar cultivation and their brutal methods of slave management with them. They were determined to rebuild their fortunes. Louisiana soon became the epicenter of American sugar production, and the conditions on its plantations were notoriously deadly. Unlike the rest of the agrarian South, which was moving into the industrial age at a slower pace, Louisiana's sugar industry embraced new technology. Gigantic steam-powered mills, evaporators, and centrifuges were installed on the largest plantations, creating massive sugar processing factories. This industrial scale demanded a constant, year-round cycle of back-breaking labor. During the harvest season, the mills operated 24 hours a day. Enslaved people were forced to work grueling 18-hour shifts, feeding the insatiable machines. The mortality rate was catastrophic. It was a well-known and horrifying fact that the life expectancy of a slave on a Louisiana sugar plantation was far shorter than that of a slave on a cotton plantation. Historians and contemporary accounts estimated that an enslaved person could only survive, on average, 7 years of this exhausting labor. People were literally worked to death. It is no surprise then that Louisiana became a hotbed of slave resistance, including the 1811 German Coast Uprising, the largest slave revolt in U.S. history. The sweet taste of sugar for the nation came at the cost of the bitterest existence imaginable for the people forced to produce it. Chapter 12. Paradise Lost, the Annexation of Hawaii. As the 19th century progressed, the insatiable global demand for sugar drove men to seek out new lands to conquer and cultivate. In the middle of the Pacific Ocean lay one of the last places on Earth untouched by this frenzy, the Kingdom of Hawaii. Located on the vital trade route between Asia and America, the islands inevitably attracted the attention of Europeans and Americans. The native Polynesians were rightfully wary of these outsiders. The famous Captain Cook met his end on Hawaii during a conflict with the islanders. Despite this, American businessmen and Christian missionaries began to arrive. They saw a paradise ripe for transformation. They saw a climate perfect for sugarcane. Almost immediately, the island's economy and politics fell under foreign influence. The missionaries and the newly arrived sugar barons exerted immense pressure on the Hawaiian king and his court. Hawaii became, in effect, a sugar addict, its entire economy hooked on a single crop with no way to break free. The final blow came in the mid-19th century with a great land division. On paper, the plan seemed fair. 1/3 of the land would go to the king, 1/3 to the local chiefs, and 1/3 to the common people. But there was a trick. To claim your land, you first had to register it with the new Western-style official bodies. The native Hawaiians, who had owned their land through tradition and custom for centuries, had no concept of these legalistic procedures, most simply ignored the directive. This was the opening the American raiders needed. They declared the unregistered land to be unclaimed, bought it for pennies, and systematically drove the local population off the lands their ancestors had farmed for generations. An oligarchy known as the Big Five, five massive American sugar corporations, soon controlled the islands. They were the true government. The native population, decimated by foreign diseases and the brutal plantation regime, became a powerless minority in their own homeland. In 1898, to protect their profits from U.S. tariffs, these sugar barons orchestrated a coup, overthrew the Hawaiian queen, and arranged for the islands to be annexed by the United States. A paradise was lost, sold for the price of sugar.
Chapter 13. Cuba, the Sugar Republic. As the 19th century waned, so did the Spanish Empire. One of its last, most prized possessions was Cuba. While never quite as dominant as neighboring Haiti had been, Cuba had a long history as a sugar powerhouse. After the Haitian Revolution crippled the world's leading producer, the Spanish saw their chance to make Cuba the new king of sugar. The Industrial Revolution supercharged this ambition. Sugar production, once an exclusive luxury, became a truly massive global industry. In 1820, the entire world produced about 400,000 tons of sugar. By the end of the century, that number had exploded to 7 million tons. Cuba was at the heart of this boom. By 1925, this small Caribbean island was producing a staggering 20% of the entire world's sugar supply. It was the undisputed sugar capital of the world. To fuel this production, Cuba, along with Brazil, became one of the last places in the civilized world to practice slavery, not abolishing it until late in the 19th century. But even after abolition, the island's fate was tied to a single crop. The decaying Spanish Empire could barely hold on, and local independence fighters looked north, to the rising power of the United States. Their chance came in 1898, during the Spanish-American War. Spain lost, and Cuba fell under a temporary U.S. military administration. In the 4 years of occupation, the U.S. tightly integrated the Cuban economy with its own. American corporations poured huge investments into the island's sugar industry, and 20% of all Cuban land was soon owned by American sugar giants. Cuba became a satellite state. The infamous Platt Amendment even gave the U.S. the right to intervene militarily whenever it saw fit. Under the U.S.-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista, this system became entrenched. 70% of all arable land belonged to foreigners. From the outside, Cuba looked prosperous, with more cars and telephones per capita than any other Latin American country. But this was a facade. While Havana glittered with luxury, the rural population suffered in abject poverty. This staggering inequality and the perception of Batista as an American puppet created the perfect conditions for a revolution. Chapter 14. Castro, Che, and the Soviet Crutch. The man who would lead that revolution had a biography deeply intertwined with sugar. Fulgencio Batista, the American-backed dictator, had grown up in poverty on sugar plantations. The man who would overthrow him, Fidel Castro, was the son of a wealthy sugar baron. On December 2, 1956, Castro and his band of revolutionaries landed on the Cuban shore. The revolution had begun. After Batista fled the country, Castro and his new socialist government had to decide what to do with the nation's defining industry. A key figure in this was Che Guevara, the iconic revolutionary. As the new head of the national bank and industry, Che authored an aggressive agrarian reform that nationalized the sugar plantations, banning foreign ownership. In a symbolic gesture, he would spend his weekends working alongside bank employees in the fields, personally harvesting sugarcane. The new leadership's plan was to break the centuries-old dependency on sugar. They aimed to diversify agriculture and kickstart a half-century-late industrialization to make the island self-sufficient. But the situation was dire. The nationalization of the plantations led to the severing of all trade ties with the United States, which imposed a crushing economic embargo. By 1962, the attempt at industrialization had failed. With the economy on the brink of collapse, the Cubans had no choice but to return to the only thing they knew: working the plantations. The dependency on America was simply replaced by a new dependency on the Soviet Union. The entire Cuban sugar industry was reoriented to serve its new communist patron. Throughout the 1960s and beyond, the USSR bought Cuban sugar at prices that were, characteristically, almost double the global market rate. This was not trade, it was a subsidy designed to keep its Caribbean ally afloat. The island of freedom had failed to escape its resource curse. The sugar needle was just as addictive as ever. Cuba would only be forced to quit when its main dealer, the Soviet Union, collapsed, plunging the island into a new era of economic crisis.
Conclusion: the lingering curse of white gold. Over 1,000 years, sugar has traveled an extraordinary path, from a mythical medicine to a cornerstone of our daily diet. Time and again, it has lifted nations to incredible heights of wealth, only to then plunge them into ruin. The price paid for this white gold has been astronomical, and its legacy is a deep, open wound on the face of our world. So many of today's racial and ethnic conflicts are the direct fallout of a global system of slavery designed specifically to serve the sugar industry. Without the insatiable demand for sugar, plantation economies might never have developed on such a monstrous scale, and the history of the last 500 years could have been profoundly different. The immense wealth accumulated by nations like Britain and the United States, the wealth that allowed them to dominate the 20th century, was in no small part built on the profits from sugar, rum, and the slave labor that produced them. Yet look at the nations that were once the centers of this industry. They are not today's economic leaders. They are, almost universally, among the world's outsiders. Haiti, once the most profitable colony on Earth, is now the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, still paying a price for its audacity to be free. Cuba remains trapped in the economic wreckage of its sugar dependency. And across Africa, the ghosts of the slave trade still haunt modern politics and stifle economic development, a direct result of a continent being rewired to export its own people for the sake of sugar production. The story of sugar is the ultimate parable of the resource curse. It is a resource that, once discovered, devours all other forms of innovation and industry. Of course, the sugar itself is not to blame. The blame lies, as it always does, with people, with our greed, our ambition, our capacity for cruelty, and, of course, our simple, undying love for a little bit of sweetness in our lives. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through the dark history of a very simple thing. We hope it has given you something to think about. Stay with us for our next series, where we'll uncover the hidden history of another item in your kitchen. Until then, take care.